I was already half asleep when the house reminded me I wasn't alone in it. The walls were quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears, broken only by the slow rhythm of my own breathing. I lay on my back staring at the ceiling, counting the cracks I had memorized since childhood, trying to convince myself that sleep would come if I stayed still long enough. My name is Ethan, and nights like that had become familiar ever since my mother remarried. 2 years earlier, she brought a new family into our home, and with it came new routines, new silences, and a new person whose presence I was still learning how to ignore. Lucas was my stepbrother in name, though the word never felt natural on my tongue. He was older than me by 3 years, taller, louder, and far more certain of his place in the world. When he moved in, he filled the house with motion, doors opening and closing, laughter echoing down hallways, music bleeding through walls. I told myself that he was just another temporary disturbance in my carefully controlled life. During the day, we were polite in the way strangers are polite. Shared meals. Casual questions. Short answers. At night, the house returned to stillness, and that was when my thoughts became dangerous. I had spent years training myself not to look too closely at men, not to linger on feelings that didn't fit the life expected of me. Lucas, without trying, disrupted that fragile balance. That he had a girlfriend, Maya. Everyone knew that. Her name came up often, usually attached to plans or arguments conducted over the phone. She visited on weekends, bringing warmth and noise with her, the kind of easy affection I had never learned how to perform. I watched them from a distance, noticing details I pretended were meaningless, the way Lucas went quiet after their calls, the way he stared at nothing when he thought no one was watching. At night, when Maya wasn't there, the house felt different. Less complete. More honest. Lucas and I crossed paths most often in the late hours, when neither of us could sleep. The kitchen light would flick on, and one of us would already be there, pretending to be surprised. We spoke softly, as if raising our voices might wake something dangerous. Those conversations were never important, yet I remembered every word. Classes. Work. Weather. Anything but the tension humming beneath the surface. That I told myself I was imagining it. That I was projecting my own loneliness onto someone who didn't belong to me in any way that mattered. Still, my body reacted before my mind could stop it. A tightening in my chest. A sudden awareness of space and distance. How close was too close. Lucas noticed more than he let on. He had a way of looking at people that felt like attention, even when he said nothing. Sometimes I caught his eyes lingering on me a second longer than necessary, and each time, he looked away first. Those moments unsettled me more than any conversation could have. One evening, after dinner, we stood alone in the hallway while our parents watched television in the living room. The air felt thick, heavy with words neither of us dared to speak. Lucas shifted his weight, rubbed the back of his neck, and smiled in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes. You ever feel like this place isn't really home? He asked. That I should have shrugged it off. Instead, I nodded. Yeah, I said. All the time. That was the first crack. Small. Almost invisible. But once it appeared, I couldn't stop seeing it. Later that night, I lay in bed replaying the moment over and over, wondering why it had mattered so much. Lucas had everything I didn't: confidence, love, certainty. Wanting him made no sense, and knowing he was taken made it worse. Desire, I had learned, didn't ask permission. It simply arrived and waited to be acknowledged. The clock on my phone glowed past midnight. Sleep refused to claim me. Just as I turned onto my side, a sound reached me through the darkness: soft footsteps moving down the hallway. They slowed near my door, paused, then stopped entirely. That I held my breath, listening. The handle shifted, just slightly, as if someone on the other side was deciding whether to turn it. The door opened before I could knock. Ryan stood there, hair slightly damp as if he had just showered, dressed in a plain t-shirt and sweatpants that made him look far less like the celebrated football captain and more like a boy next door. His casualness disarmed me. Daniel, he said with a grin that was neither forced nor overly bright. I wasn't sure you'd actually come. I almost apologized, but the words tangled in my throat. Instead, I stepped inside, taking in the room. It was smaller than I imagined, cluttered with textbooks, sports gear, and a half-folded blanket draped across his bed. The space smelled faintly of cologne and laundry detergent, ordinary scents that somehow felt intimate. Ryan closed the door quietly behind me, and for a moment, silence stretched between us. Then he motioned toward a chair while he perched on the edge of the bed. "So," he began, "what's it like, having someone but not really having them here?" The directness of his question startled me. My instinct was to retreat, but the sincerity in his tone pulled me forward. "It's hard," I admitted after a pause. "Ethan and I, we talk every day, but sometimes it feels like words aren't enough. There are gaps you can't fill through a phone screen." Ryan nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "I get that. People think I have it all together, but sometimes it feels like no one really knows me. I'm surrounded by teammates, fans, noise, but none of it feels real." His words carried a heaviness I didn't expect. For the first time, I saw beyond his surface confidence to the isolation beneath it. That loneliness mirrored my own. Our conversation unfolded naturally from there. He asked about my classes, my family, my plans after college. I found myself speaking freely, as if the walls of his dorm granted permission to be more honest than I usually allowed. He listened closely, leaning forward, occasionally nodding in ways that made me feel heard rather than judged. At some point, our words slowed. The air shifted, thickening with unspoken possibility. Ryan leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Sometimes the person we need most isn't the one we expect." The statement landed between us like a spark. My pulse quickened. I thought of Ethan, steady, patient, miles away. I thought of Ryan, warm, magnetic, only inches from me. I knew the line between conversation and something more had been crossed, yet I didn't step back. Ryan's hand brushed mine, tentative but deliberate. The touch sent a shiver through me, a reminder of how long I had gone without closeness. I should have pulled away. Instead, I stayed still, caught in the gravity of the moment. "Daniel," he whispered, searching my face. "I don't want to make this harder for you. But I can't pretend I don't feel it." His confession unmoored me. Desire and guilt collided in my chest. Ethan's voice lingered in my memory, yet Ryan's presence pressed on me with undeniable force. In that suspended space, my resistance faltered. What followed was inevitable. Words gave way to silence, and silence gave way to action. The room seemed to shrink around us as boundaries dissolved. Every gesture, every look, carried both intensity and hesitation, as if we both knew we were stepping into forbidden territory but couldn't resist the pull. When it was over, we sat in the dim light, the reality of what had just happened settling heavily between us. Ryan leaned back against the wall, breathing steady, eyes closed. For him, perhaps it was a release. For me, it was a storm. I stared at the floor, heart racing, hands trembling. The weight of betrayal pressed down on me, sharper than I imagined. I thought of Ethan, how he trusted me, how he believed in the strength of our bond. And I thought of Ryan, how, despite the guilt, I couldn't deny the fire he had ignited. The clock on Ryan's desk glowed past midnight. I stood, fumbling with my jacket. Ryan opened his eyes, watching me quietly. "You don't have to run," he said, but I was already at the door, the air outside pulling me back to reality. My phone buzzed in my pocket, 3 missed calls from Ethan. I stepped into the corridor, the cool air against my skin a harsh contrast to the warmth I had left behind. Guilt clawed at me, yet so did a strange exhilaration. What had begun as a conversation had unraveled into something irreversible, and as I walked back to my dorm, I knew the hardest part wasn't what had happened, it was what would come next. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of quiet companionship. Adrian and I grew inseparable, our doors swinging open as though hinges no longer mattered. Meals were shared, study notes exchanged, and the silence of midnight hours filled with conversations that left us more entangled than either of us dared to admit. The hostel had hundreds of boys, yet it often felt like Adrian and I lived in a world apart, divided from the rest by invisible walls. but beneath the comfort of routine, unease grew. I caught myself watching him too long, memorizing the curve of his smile or the sound of his laughter. Each glance carried a weight I could no longer deny. And though I told myself to step back, to reclaim the distance we had so easily discarded, I found it impossible. Adrian had become a gravitational pull, and I was helplessly caught in his orbit. The conflict within me sharpened whenever Michael's name appeared. Adrian would occasionally mention him, never with enthusiasm, never with the warmth I expected from someone speaking of love. Once, when his phone rang during dinner, I noticed the name glowing on his screen. He silenced it, muttering something about bad timing, and continued eating as though nothing had happened. I said nothing, but my chest tightened with a mix of curiosity and guilt. Why was he ignoring the man he claimed to love? One evening, we lingered in my room long after most lights in the hostel had gone dark. Our books lay forgotten on the desk, and we sat cross-legged on the floor, speaking in low tones. Adrian confessed that he often felt misunderstood, that Michael expected things from him he could not always give. His words were steady, but his eyes betrayed a vulnerability he rarely allowed others to see. I wanted to comfort him, to say something meaningful, but all I managed was silence. In that silence, I realized my role was shifting. I was no longer just his friend. I was becoming his confidant, the one who knew the cracks in his carefully constructed armor. Guilt gnawed at me. I should have set boundaries, should have reminded him of the man waiting for him elsewhere. Yet the truth was crueler. I didn't want to. I wanted to be the one he turned to, the one who filled the void Michael seemed unable to reach. Each word he spoke deepened my longing and eroded my resolve. The night of confession came quietly, almost tenderly. We had been arguing over something trivial, whether he should reconcile with Michael or demand more honesty from him. I had spoken with unusual sharpness, frustration boiling over, not at Michael but at the invisible tether that bound Adrian away from me. He fell silent, staring at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. And then, without warning, he leaned forward and pressed his lips against mine. The kiss was brief but electric, shattering the fragile wall I had clung to for weeks. When he pulled away, the air between us seemed charged, the silence deafening. My heart pounded as I searched his face for regret, but all I saw was confusion that mirrored my own. We sat there, eyes locked, caught between desire and dread. Neither of us spoke of it the next day. Yet the current between us had shifted irreversibly. Every word, every gesture carried the echo of that moment. And though we tried to pretend otherwise, the truth hovered like a storm cloud. We had crossed a line. That night, Adrian returned to my room. There were no excuses this time, no pretense of study or conversation. He closed the door softly behind him, and in the quiet that followed, we gave in to what we had both been resisting. The weight of secrecy pressed down on me even as I felt the exhilaration of closeness I had long imagined. It was everything I had wanted, and everything I feared. When dawn broke, the world outside continued as though nothing had changed. Boys shouted in the corridor, breakfast smells drifted from the mess hall, and life resumed its predictable rhythm. But for me, nothing was the same. I lay awake long after Adrian slipped back into his own room, replaying every detail, every breath. The thrill was intoxicating, but beneath it lurked a shadow I could not ignore, that we had betrayed someone who trusted him, someone who deserved honesty. I had stepped willingly into the role of the intruder, the secret. The thought should have filled me with shame, but instead, it left me torn, between guilt and the dangerous sweetness of having what I had silently desired. And as I stared at the ceiling, I knew with painful clarity, the path ahead would not be simple. What had begun with a knock on the door had become something neither of us could control. The house no longer felt like a place of waiting. It felt like a place that had already decided how much it would give me and how much it would take away. Lucas kept his promise of distance, and I kept mine, even when every instinct urged me to cross the space we had agreed to protect. That we became careful versions of ourselves. Polite. Brief. Functional. At meals, conversation stayed safely shallow. When our parents laughed, I joined in a second too late. When Lucas smiled, it looked real again, and that unsettled me more than his earlier restlessness ever had. Healing, I learned, does not ask permission from those still bleeding. One evening, I returned home later than usual to find Lucas alone in the living room. The television was on, volume low, images flickering without meaning. He glanced up, then back down, as if unsure whether acknowledging me would reopen something fragile. "I'm moving out," he said, the words landed softly but carried force. "When?" I asked. "Soon," Lucas replied. "I need to figure out who I am without hurting anyone else." I nodded, because there was nothing else to do. Pride and loss coexisted in my chest, equal and inseparable. "That's probably for the best." He hesitated. "For what it's worth, Ethan, you mattered. You still do." I swallowed. So did the truth. Lucas smiled faintly at that, then stood and disappeared down the hallway. I listened to his footsteps fade, the sound both familiar and already becoming a memory. After he moved out, the house changed again. Not dramatically. Just enough to notice. His room stayed empty, the door closed, a reminder of something unresolved but no longer active. I stopped checking the hallway at night. Sleep came easier, though dreams sometimes carried echoes of what might have been. I began speaking more honestly with Daniel, saying out loud the things I once buried. He reminded me that desire was not a crime, but choices still carried responsibility. Loving someone unavailable did not make me broken, staying silent forever would have. Weeks turned into months. Life continued in ordinary ways. New routines formed. Old feelings softened into something quieter, less demanding. Then one afternoon, I received a message from Lucas. Short. "Careful that I hope you're doing okay." I stared at the screen longer than necessary before replying. "I am. I hope you are too." That was all. No confessions. No reopening doors. Just acknowledgement. And somehow, that was enough. That night, I lay in my room, aware of how different the silence felt now. It no longer pressed against me. It rested. I thought about the version of myself who had counted ceiling cracks to avoid facing his own truth. I wished I could tell him that wanting did not mean losing control, and letting go did not mean failure. Some stories end with reunion. Others end with clarity. Mine ended with understanding, of boundaries, of timing, of myself. As I closed my eyes, I knew this was not the end of becoming who I was meant to be. It was simply the moment I stopped pretending I hadn't already begun.